thought the hook was a better idea.
All right, here we go. I call this meeting of the Magnolia Independent School District to order. Let the record show that a quorum of board members is present, that this meeting has been duly called, and that notice of this meeting has been posted in accordance with Texas Open Meeting Act, Texas Government Code Chapter 551. So if everybody will please stand, I'll go ahead and lead us in an invocation in our pledges. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for an opportunity to gather together and serve our district and to serve you in any way that we can and to glorify you in all that we do. Please guide us and direct us, keep us in your path, guide us in your will, and watch over us as we make any decisions we make, and to reflect the best interest of the district and the students. And just thank you for all the blessings you give us. Thank you for watching over us, protecting our country, protecting our armed forces, and for just providing for us and blessing us each and every day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible.
Okay, Dr. Morris, I think you're first up.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blizzard, and thank you all for being here again this morning. I know we have had multiple of these types of meetings. Obviously, this isn't my choice. It's something we have to do this time of year based on truth and taxation requirements, and after we receive our certified values and perform our effective and rollback tax rate calculation. So thank you for being here. But first off, we are asking you to approve the proposed tax rate. Obviously, this is something we've talked about in each and every budget workshop, but this approval of the proposed rate will go into the form of the public notice that I'll talk about in just a moment. But obviously, the most important thing is to understand that this is not the adoption of the tax rates. That will come later after the public hearing on August 19th. Okay. We are proposing a total tax rate of just under $1.31, consisting of 97 cents on the M&O and $33.95 on the INS, for a decrease in the overall tax rate by 7 pennies. Okay? And I guess we can look at it just quickly, the notice, just to see if you have any questions on that. So here's the notice that will be published in the local newspaper. And again, for truth and taxation purposes, this must be published between 10 to 30 days prior to the public hearing, again, which is scheduled for August 19th. Format is the same that it's been for many, many years. I guess I would direct you to the center of the page for total appraised value and total taxable value. You can see that the total appraised value for Magnolia ISD taxing jurisdiction went from $7.6 billion to $8.5 billion. And total taxable value, 2 columns down or 2 rows down, went from $6.5 billion to almost $7.2 billion, which equates roughly to 11% increase. And I can say that in looking at some of the other districts in the area, I think Conroe was at 6.5% growth, and I don't remember which other one I looked at, but it was closer to between 5 and 6. I think it was Tomball that I was looking at, if I recall correctly. So. That is substantial growth. You can see below that how much of that growth was due to new property. For current tax year, 171, almost 172 million. Okay. Also have to list, obviously, the bonded indebtedness, outstanding principal of 165 million. I know that's something we've talked about with our debt structure and early payoff plan and so forth. Towards the middle of the page, comparison of proposed tax rate with last year's rates. Probably the most important thing here, and which aligns with our budget workshops and HB3, you'll see that last year's rate in the far right 2 columns generated $6,800 in local revenue per student versus $2,987 in state revenue per student. And then in the bottom row in that section, you'll see the local revenue per student has increased to $7,082, even though the tax rate has decreased by 7 pennies due to the increase in the property values. And of course, related to HB3, you'll see that the state revenue per student went from $31.66 to $34.25, which roughly aligns with what we had talked about at the last workshop. Finally, in this section right here, in terms of rollback tax rate, again, we have the ability to tax up to almost $1.31, which is the amount that we're proposing this morning. Here's a rough estimate of fund balances at the end of this year as well, conservatively. So again, this will go in the newspaper tomorrow. As soon as this meeting is over, I'll contact Montgomery County and allow them to move forward. But for action item purposes, we're proposing approval of a rate of $30.95, consisting of 97 cents on the M&O and $33.95 on the INS. Be glad to answer any questions.
I think it's interesting that, to point out that of that 11%, a third of that is new growth. The other 2/3 is actual increase from existing property valuations, right?
Yes, sir. That is something that's very interesting. That's something that we had been talking about with the chief appraiser for several months now. We've been getting updates every week, and it pretty much aligns with what he said from the very beginning, due to reevaluations primarily associated with the land portion of existing properties, if you will. So I do not anticipate, and again, I may be reaching, but I do not anticipate that sort of growth or revaluation increase, if you will, on the backs of already existing folks is sustainable, to an extent. I mean, obviously, again, there was a substantial revaluation for land purposes. So hopefully, we'll see that number grow substantially for new land, new values in the very near future, and we think we will. We know we will with the new residences coming in and developments and things of that nature in the next few years. So. Love to see the growth, but would love for more of it to be associated with new stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
As a
I
property.
knew you would agree with that, Chuck.
Right.
And hey, Eric, on the
Yes,
total
sir.
taxable value of new property in that middle box, does each year stand alone on itself? I mean, that's not because it went down, but, last year to this year.
Oh, yes, sir, absolutely, yes. So the 200 million was the new land associated with the 2018 tax year. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Each year stands alone. Yes, sir.
And I mean, with all the growth.
Yeah, I think, Travis, I think that obviously with all the developments that we've talked about with the Autobahn, the others that are on the horizon, with the completion of the roads, and road infrastructure that's coming our way, I think we're going to see that sort of growth in the next 3 to 4 years of around 10% plus, but we're going to see most of that assigned, hopefully, with new values, for sure.
So Eric, are we seeing that area districts are doing the exact same thing, taking just?
Yes, sir, it's a good question, Chuck. We're seeing most districts reduced by about 7 pennies as a result of HB3 and the requirement for M&O purposes. I have seen a handful, including Conroe and I believe Tomball as well, where the decrease is not quite as much because they're decreasing their M&O, but in some cases they're having to increase their INS based on some of the new language in HB3. I think Conroe in particular, they've historically used some of their M&O to pay for INS, and there's some new language in there. We talked about the tax swap and things of that nature where they're hesitant to do that, so they're actually increasing their INS but also decreasing the M&O at the same time. So. But by and large, Chuck, I would say across the state, the 7 penny thing is pretty consistent.
Okay. Have you seen anybody that was wealthy enough to be able to go past 7?
I saw one in the Austin area not too long ago that did something like that went down a little, slightly more than that for M&O purposes. But the funding mechanisms have changed a little bit, but there's many things that haven't. I mean, when you decrease that M&O more, I mean, you're going to cheat yourselves not only on the M&O, but on the state funding as well, substantially.
Right.
Because there's still the tier 2 funding component that's associated with that motivates districts to tax as high as possible. So.
Sure.
Well, plus you can't look at that in isolation because the contribution per
Absolutely.
student is all over the budget, right? So-
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, we're going to continue to have the tax rate compression for the next however many years. It's difficult to say exactly how much it will go down next year, but my estimate at this point is the M&O will go down likely closer to about 92 cents next year as well, which would be another decrease of about 5 pennies. So some of that will have to work itself out depending on our values, but that's my estimate at this point. Well, that's based on an 8% property value growth. We would go down approximately another 4.5 pennies the following year, so. And the state is going to make up the difference at least for that year, so. Then we'll see what happens after 2 years. Somehow, exactly.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. So we need a motion that we accept the proposed total tax rate of $1.3095 with a maintenance and operation tax rate of 97 cents per $100 of taxable value and a debt rate of 33.95 cents per $100 of taxable value. So motion by Kelly, seconded by Travis. All in favor? That motion passes. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
You can continue.
Carry on. Okay. Next item, just again, kind of housekeeping of sorts for truth and taxation purposes. We already are aware of when the public hearing will be held, but we must do so in the form of official action. So we are proposing, as we've done in years past, to hold our public hearing to discuss the tax rate and budget prior to the regular scheduled meeting on August 19th at 6:30 p.m. So my recommendation that we approve that date and time for the hearing. And then we will wrap this budget season up.
Okay, we need a motion that the board set the date and time for a public hearing to discuss the 2019-20 budget and proposed tax rates for Monday, August 19th at 6:30 p.m. at the Graves Education Support Center at 31141 Nichols Sawmill Road, Magnolia, Texas. Motion by Chuck, seconded by Sonia. All in favor? That motion passes as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Rob, you're up next.
Yes, sir. Typically, this time of year that we adopt our code of conduct, which is a legal document, which is why it requires you guys to ratify it. The code of conduct is usually targeted at student behavior. This last legislative session, what made this unique was a lot of the things that were passed to put into the code of conduct are entirely addressing adult behavior. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the items that you should have in front of you. So you have, of course, every time we use TASB's model, and then we adopt it to our local district. And if we have any questions, we usually work with Doug Brock to kind of help us clarify any language. So there's always little tiny verbiage changes that are really inconsequential. They're just clarifying language. So we usually don't worry too much about those types of things. So if you start with item number 2, they had us put in a section of techniques we cannot use for discipline. Now, these techniques, to my knowledge, are not used by any administrator in our district. They range from a prohibition against chemical restraints on a child to you will no longer tie a child to a chair and, suspend the chair. So it's kind of a bizarre little list, but it was targeting, quite honestly, when I did a little digging on it, it was targeting behavior by SROs. And so they made you put it in there, but that's not even where you would address SRO behavior. So it's kind of an odd placement, but we're required by law to put it in there. I can tell you, when you read the list, you'll understand what I'm saying. We're not using that list. I don't think we're in any danger of doing that, but we definitely, when we do in-service with our administrators, we'll be pointing that out just so we're all on the same page. House Bill 811 is probably the biggest change for us as administrators. We now have to consider not just the student's intent, whether or not there's a disability, the factors, there were 4 factors we always had to consider. Now they've added 2 more factors. One of those factors is whether or not the student is homeless, and one of those factors is whether or not the student is or has been in family protective services such as foster care or CPS control. So we just have to consider whether or not that influences the behavior. It will have to go a long ways to breach what a lot of us refer to as the moral imperative. Right and wrong is right and wrong regardless of conditions. So, but there may be conditions where that absolutely is created by some of the conditions they're living in. So, but those are factors we now have to consider. So that's stated throughout, whether it's regular discipline, placement in ISS, placement in DAP, or placement in JJAP. We have to consider those items. So those are now included in there. There's also, based on Senate Bill 11, a safe and threat assessment team. Doug's working through us because the language in that bill is a little vague as to who all sits on the safe and threat assessment team. And, you know, you're not going to run into a situation and go, I'd like to call time out. We have to go get in front of our team and determine whether or not you're dangerous. So it's got to be a more fluid group than that. And so we're working through the components of how that looks. We don't have to have that in place until second semester. So we have a little bit of lead time for us to work through it, but you will see that term in there. So I wanted to bring it to your attention. Another thing that they changed for our behavior is if we suspend a student out of school, there is a belief that no student away from school has internet resources. So if we suspend a student from us, we must provide work for their foundation classes, and it cannot be internet based. So it's going to have to be the old textbook and paper or the old runoff ditto or something like that. And we're working through that. We've already kind of breached that. You'll probably see fewer 3-day suspensions, except for when we're trying to transition to DAP and JJAP. But you'll see fewer suspensions over long term because we'll want to make sure we suspend an ISS combination to get the work done prior to going back to the class. And we're having to work through some things on the teacher side, because if we suspend and give him work and the kid goes home, because keep in mind, he's getting suspended for behavior. So if he goes home and refuses to do the work, we're gonna have to work with teachers and say, that's not late. Because the first teacher inclination was, did you give him the work when he went home? Yes. Well, he's late, he didn't do it. So we're gonna have to work through some parts on that to make sure that we're a little better trying to work through that. And part of that is working through the combination of straight out-of-school suspension to a out-of-school ISS, and let's get it wrapped up before we go back to class. Make sure that we get our work done so that the kid doesn't wind up in a position where we're looking at a double punishment. I hope that makes sense. The other pieces that you'll see on there is we are now mandated a better transition component when a kid comes back from JJAP or DAP back into the school, and we're going to be involving some of our counselors to accomplish that, but that had to be placed in our code of conduct as well. We cannot suspend any student that is homeless anymore. I don't think we ever really did, but I guess they don't think you ought to suspend a kid home when he doesn't have a home. So I think that's a pretty logical piece, but we have to put it in our code of conduct. And the last one that's I think I've given you is, again, this is the student code of conduct, but we had to put a lot of things about adult behavior. So we have to put in there what exactly is our SROs supposed to do for us at school. And we basically ask them to do 3 things. We'd like you to enforce the law. Strangely enough, they're law enforcement, so we'd like them to do that. Then we'd like them to help us keep a quality environment and establish relationships with kids. And then finally, we just want them to be a support there for whatever we need to do to make the safe and orderly environment. So if that's part of getting rid of our parking lots in such a way that nobody's banging into each other like bumper cars, well, that's that safe and orderly piece. So those are basically their 3 target goals, and we had to put those in the code of conduct for students. So, as you can see, there were a lot of little legislative pieces in this, but most of them, if you really step back, you go, wait a minute, that's what adults really are doing in there. As far as the process for placing a kid, whether or not he's receiving due process, didn't really change. Whether or not you're talking about what constitutes misconduct, it didn't really change. It just changed how we approach that subject and the components we have to consider in that process. So I think you have the code of conduct in its entirety as an attachment. But if not, I'm glad to entertain any questions.
My question's always, I mean, and what we've talked about a lot in the last year or so is just the vaping component of it, because I think that's the biggest thing on my mind. Does that change anything as far as disciplining that, or is it, and then when you talk about family protective agency or homeless considerations, explain that a little bit more to me. I mean, I understand you can't suspend them, they don't have a home, but how does that affect a child that you're disciplining?
Okay, let's say a child has stolen $20,
Okay.
but the $20 that he stole is to turn around and pay for his field trip. And that child is homeless and didn't have $20. That may be part of your consideration before you just drop that hammer on that kid. You may be going, wait a minute here. He was in a situation where he felt like he had to steal to be part of that. Now, does that change what we do? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the situation with that kiddo. Depends on, does this kid steal daily? Depends on, is this a one-time event? There's a lot of factors that go into that consideration. But that's an easy way to just say, would that impact your decision? And the complicated answer is, it might. It might, depending on how that whole matter is approached, and depends on the kid, depends on the situation. But that's an easy example. Would a kid in foster care forge a document that requires a parent's signature? They might, if they wanted their parent back. Is that something that you'd necessarily say, well, you forged that document, you should go to DAEP? Probably not under any circumstances, but it might consider what you do, how you do handle that situation based upon where that kid's currently residing.
But to Travis's point on the vaping, did they do anything specific around the vaping issue? Because you can't talk to a teacher in this state that's not a problem in their school.
I don't know if you can talk to a teacher in this country where that's not a problem. We are in process of developing an approach to that, and it's kind of not bluntly communicated in this, but subtly that we can do what we need to do. Dr. Bullock, myself, several administrators involved, we have looked at this and kind of, again, it's an issue all over. So how do we handle that? Well, we're looking at both. There are some tangible consequences. And then there's a backside that says, here's an educational component. So, Dr. Bullock, would you like to address that?
I can address some of that. We'll be presenting to you guys coming up in August. I want to bring to you some of the particulars of our specific stance on vaping. I think, it's already starting to play out. We have a coordinated approach that is across extracurriculars involving athletics and fine arts, and some set responses and consequences in a way that's communicated from our coaching staff, our band directors, our sponsors, and then a school discipline piece that's with that as well. On the consequence side for kids, it would align more with the code of conduct. Travis, if that helps you.
Yeah, I guess my biggest question was, is this anything the state legislature did in this last session?
No, sir, they did not.
It didn't address it really,
Well,
didn't make it easier
there
or
was
harder
one.
to prosecute
Well,
kids, or parents, I guess.
There was one component they did that was easier, the prohibition of possession of anything under the age of 21. So they moved the purchase of the vape to 21 years of age. And so anybody who's under the age of 21 shouldn't have that in their possession. That makes it a little easier. When it was 18, you were fighting a lot of 18, 19-year-olds on campus, you know, going, but it's in my car. And yeah, but your car reeks of other stuff, not tobacco. And, you know, there was a lot of components. Now there should be no one who's a student in our school system that should ever be in possession of it. So it does, that part did make it a little easier, but they didn't really assign that many consequences to it. That's rolling back to that's the school's responsibility.
So they didn't really give us anything that gives us more teeth in how to approach it. And you know, I guess, you know, we're still under the stance of, you know, from a legal standpoint, that they do not want to criminalize behavior in schools. They want to avoid that as much as possible, to keep kids off of this school to prison pipeline, I think is the way some of the politicians put it. So we're limited in assigning misdemeanors to kids for behavior that occurs on campuses because of that. They'd rather those type things be handled by school discipline and not by law enforcement or in a criminal sense, even though they have made 21 the age, you know, to buy and be in possession of vaping materials.
So it looks like an opportunity to relax. It sounds like opportunities to relax discipline in a lot of ways. Is that true?
Probably the biggest thing is not so much relax the discipline, but to make sure the structural components that surround how we implement discipline are more sound. So the student behavior and what we expect out of that student behavior shouldn't change. What has changed in this are what are the frameworks that surround adult behavior on how they approach discipline. And one of the aversive techniques that we're prohibited from is screaming in a student's face. Well, that's probably a good idea if we stop that anyway. So, you know, it's more how the adult handles himself with the child. Have we put a framework together that's more solid? And that's really where the changes are at.
Does that apply to coaches?
Well, I don't think
There's a gray area there.
Extracurricular activities are not necessarily part of FAPE.
Yeah, that's up for interpretation. I think also on the homeless and foster care, and you know, there's still consequences we assign for behavior, even if a student is you know, is homeless. It may mean it's an in-school suspension instead of an out-of-school suspension, but it doesn't mean that they've got carte blanche to misbehave.
Correct.
In schools.
And we're aware of how many homeless kids that we have in the
Yes, ma'am.
district? Is that a big number?
No. Not in Magnolia. If you were in a district where there were places that could create compound-like conditions, we used to eat down at Spaghetti Warehouse, and there was an area under a bridge that created a little compound off of the bayou that created a little compound where homeless would reside. We do not have a homeless shelter in our district, so pieces like that kind of limit some of ours. But we still get folks who have moved in with friends and things like that, and camping in their yard or whatever. We have some of that.
Do we have all the kids identified that are in CPS or foster kids?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
yeah.
Usually the Family Protective Services will notify us. One of the hats I get to wear is our foster care liaison hat. And I get notified by the state if they're placing a kid. They'll call me a lot of times and say, hey, this family's gonna take these two kiddos, we need to get them in school. Especially if there's situations where they were in our district and they've moved within driving distance of our district, and they're calling to tell us, please don't withdraw the student, which we can't if it's a foster care situation.
Well, so a lot of this seems to make, you mentioned some of it's common sense, right? You would do
Yes.
it anyway in the routine,
Yes,
normal
sir.
routine of doing what you do. What are one or two items that are material changes for what you do?
Probably the biggest is to figure out how the safety and threat assessment team interacts fluidly with behavior coordinators who have not previously taken a kiddo and gone and had a conversation with a team and say, do you think he's a threat? Do you not think he's a threat? We trust a lot of our behavior coordinators to have that conversation with the principal of the building, and they will usually land on that decision. They've usually involved this building as part of that decision-making process. So we feel fairly confident we're not far from being able to implement that. We just need to make sure we fulfill the letters of the law. But that's probably the biggest change that I saw in there that's not something we normally do, was to figure out how that team fits in there.
Any other questions? All right, sir, we need a motion that the board approve the 2019-2020 Student Code of Conduct as presented by Rob Stewart. Motion by Kelly, seconded by Christie. All in favor? That motion passes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so we'll now adjourn into our executive session for personnel discussion recommendations pursuant to Texas Government Code 551.074 and discussion of purchase, sale, exchange, or value of real property pursuant to Texas Government Code 551.072. And actually, we're not.
If you just need to adjourn and don't need to go into executive session, you can make a motion to adjourn.
There you go. Make a motion that we turn the page, and here we go. Thank you. You know, I think you do a lot better. I need a motion that we adjourn this meeting. Motion by Christie, seconded by Travis. All in favor? This meeting's done.
Okay.
8:10.